So, Guten Chodesh to everybody. Today is Rosh Chodesh Nisan, the beginning of the new month of Nisan, the beginning of the new Jewish year, actually. Nisan is the first month of the Jewish year. And that means that in 2 weeks, it's Pesach. So get ready. We are studying chapter 2 in Pirkei Avot, and we're up to the 4th Mishnah. Okay, so we have, hopefully everybody has some kind of text in front of them. And this is, it starts, he used to say, he would say, and this is Rabbi Gamliel, the son of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, the patriarch, the prince. He himself was a patriarch, Rabbi Gamliel, he inherited the position. So we're talking about the beginning of the 3rd century CE, somewhere in the first couple of decades, maybe 230 CE. And this is another, this is his 3rd Mishnah that he has the sayings to share with us. So first, as we do in the past, let's have a translation, please, from anybody except for Bill and Josie. Okay, no offense. But yeah, okay, Geraldine, go ahead.
Excuse me. This was a favorite teaching of Rabbi Gamliel. Do his will as though it were yours, so that he will do your will as though it were his. Nullify your will for his, that he may nullify the will of others for yours.
Okay. Little tweaks on that. Does anybody have any slightly different one before we get to Rabbi Shapiro's translation, which I'm sure will be a slightly different rendering? Okay, good. All right. So we're talking about the divine will and the human will, and aligning them and working with them. So let's see how Rabbi Shapiro deals with this. So which of you are going to do it? Bill, go ahead.
I am. It's actually not that far off. It's a little bit more literary, but it's not that far off. He says, align your will with God's will, and God's will becomes your will. Surrender your will to God's will, and God will surrender others' will to your will.
Okay, good. So we have, as you say, it sounds like we're really pretty much aligned between these two translations, which often go in interestingly different directions. So, okay, so now we have to start thinking about, what does that mean? What does that mean to align your will, or to, what was the translation we had earlier? Do his will? What was the translation?
Do his will as though it were yours.
Okay, so so there already we have a slight difference, right? Between aligning one's will and doing somebody else's will, make somebody else's will your will. But I mean, it's like I say, it's a slight subtle point. But what does it mean to people? Right? There's a recognition here that we have our own will, right? We believe in free will. We believe the word here is ratzon, right? So yehi ratzon milfanecha, may it be your will, we say, right? We have a will, and we acknowledge in this teaching, Rabbi Gamliel says, God has a will. And they're not identical from the get-go, right? They're not the same. They're not aligned. They're not overlapping. And then it's up to us to start a process that puts our will in line with God, synchronizing our will with God's will. So this, like I say, it really presupposes that we know what we're referring to when we talk about God's will and our will. What is all of that all about? Sarita, you wanted to say something?
Right, I was just thinking that, we have these mitzvot, and you can do the mitzvot and think, I really would rather not do this, but I have to, I have no choice. Or you can approach it with a mindset that this is a beautiful thing to do and I'm going to do it. So I think that it's really about the mindset of how you carry out the mitzvot.
Okay, anybody else? Yeah, Josie.
I
Under-
think it's
yeah, good.
trying to get us away from the self-centeredness, especially in these times where everything seems to be about me. And if we could take a bigger view, the rabbi uses the phrase God's will, but encompass everything else, not just you.
Okay. More. Anybody else? Comments?
It just
Bill.
seems very, sorry.
Okay, go ahead, Audrey. All right, good. You jumped in. Okay. go
No,
ahead.
Bill, go first. You raised your hand, then I'll go after Bill.
Oh, it doesn't matter. Yeah, what troubles me about this is not specifically this Mishnah, but the idea of God's will. I think it's a little bit more out there in Christian communities where one asks, what is God's will for me? But this Mishnah, at least as the translation we have here, seems to assume that we can know what God's will is. And I'm increasingly skeptical of that possibility.
All right, so
There are,
go ahead.
yeah, that's just it. I'm not troubled by this. I don't find any deep moral difficulties, but it's a more or less an intellectual one. How on earth do I know what God's will is? We often say, well, go to the Torah. The Torah is our guide to life. The Torah tells us to kill people.
Under certain circumstances.
Under certain circumstances, it's true, but it's pretty clear that it asks us to engage in genocide. And
Under certain circumstances.
I'm deferring to you. But however we want to interpret that stuff, it's still difficult to understand what exactly does it mean? What does it mean? And then what does it mean in terms of understanding what God wants us to do? I mean, we certainly have example after example from every religious tradition of people being absolutely convinced that God's will is for them to do some absolutely horrific thing, which seems perfectly obvious to the rest of us until we look at our own tradition. Circumstances or not, we seem to be asked sometimes to do horrific things, stone people to death, and so on. So I'm just troubled by the possibility of fulfilling this desideratum.
Okay. Audrey.
Well, Bill's comments kind of knocked out my entire.
That's why I wanted you to go
I think
first.
it's very valid, and that's why it knocked it out.
What were you going to say?
What I was going to say is that, this is sort of the core of most I think, religion, not just Judaism. It's just the core of surrendering your ego to something beyond yourself. That's good. And the good part is, like, I really do block out all of those portions of the Torah in my mind until it becomes relevant in the actual world. And I say, I see that. But I tend to think that God's will is the golden rule, essentially, as a bottom line core. I am, however, do just want to draw attention to the last line, which I don't know what to make of it, which is, will nullify others' will in favor of your will. I don't know. That feels concerning to me. I don't know what to make of that. It feels arrogant.
Right. So on the one hand, there seems to be a deferring and getting out of one's own will and subjugating it or subsuming it within
The
divine will.
narcissism that we all live in.
Right. And then it turns around and says, and then guess what? You'll benefit because then your will prevail.
Yeah.
So it sounds a little contradictory, right? Yeah. So let's come back to that a little later, hopefully. Anybody else want to, now that we've gotten some pretty strong statements here, react, add, subtract? Geraldine, and then Adam, and then Josie.
I always feel that if we didn't follow God's will, we wouldn't be in existence anymore, no matter how terrible his suggestions are for what we should do throughout the Bible. That's how I deal with it, Audrey.
What do you mean? Why not? Why wouldn't we be in existence?
Because if we didn't kill the other tribes or whatever, we wouldn't be here. They'd kill us.
So there's a wisdom underneath it, even though it sounds sticky.
No,
or
it sounds so
uncomfortable.
terrible.
Mhm.
Yes.
Okay. Good. Adam.
So I'm I'm kind of getting caught in a loop with this language. There's a reference to two wills, God's will and a human's will. So the implication is that you're free to choose, the human is free to choose his will, except what the language seems to be saying is you're free to choose, your will, as long as your will is God's will. And the implication of that seems to be if your will is not God's will, you're not free to do it.
No, I don't see that as the implication. I think the opposite is the implication. The consequences may be no good, but the freedom to choose something else is absolute. That's why the Rabbi Gamliel has to say it's worth it for you to choose God's will. You may not want to, but it's gonna pay off. That's the second part of each of these two statements. But that's presupposing that means no, I could choose not to go. And look, going back to the Torah is chock full of stories of people who don't do God's will. So it's clear from the get-go that we absolutely have that freedom, and that freedom has not been taken away from us. That's the challenge. The challenge is, and that's part of modernity, right? Part of modernity is whether it's, to be critiqued as being too individualistic or too narcissistic, but it also is the discovery of the fact, hey, we really are free and independent beings. We don't have to always just buckle under the church or the government or the Torah or whatever it is. We actually have this agency of our own. So what Ram Gamliel is saying is now use your agency to make your will congruent with God's will, which it isn't at the beginning and will only be that way if you choose to do so. So it's not deterministic at all. Yeah, Josie.
I have Rabbi Shapiro's book. I'd like to hear the last line of the other book that people use, because
Geraldine, you got it one more time?
Yep. The last line?
The last phrase, yeah.
Nullify your will for his, that he may nullify the will of others for yours.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, good. So I want to come back to that first question. And we had a certain kind of suggestion. Sarita sort of like gave a quick answer at the beginning by identifying God's will with the mitzvot, with the commandments. So how do we know what God's will is? The answer is we have a sanctified tradition, a revelation that's codified and written down, and that's it. The problem with that is that it ain't necessarily so. Part of the Torah that's codified and written is one of the most foundational stories, which is Abraham confronting God after God says, it's my will. My will is I'm going to destroy Sodom. That's my will. They're completely disgusting, terrible people. I can't not tell you ahead of time, but I want to tell you I'm destroying Sodom. And what does Abraham say? What's wrong with you? How can you possibly think to do that? So clearly, it's not obvious to Abraham that in that particular moment, he has to say to God, well, I guess if you said so, that's okay. Now, and this is the famous contradiction, right? However, when we get to the Akedah, when we get to the binding of Isaac, Abraham doesn't say a peep. And Abraham just says, okay, if this is God's will, then that's what I have to do. Let's take the Torah readings that we've been reading the last couple of weeks. God gives us the 10 commandments. And then the children of Israel create an idol. They dance around the golden calf. And God says to Moses, I'm destroying them. That's it. They're no good. I can't believe what they just did. And then what does Moses say? No, how could you possibly do that? You can't do that. And Moses goes through an extensive process to not only to stop God from destroying us, back to Geraldine's point, that our very existence depends on God's will. But then he says more than that. I want you to love the children again. I want you to reconcile. I want you to come back. So whose will is being canceled? For the sake of whose will? The divine will. Back to Bill's question. Back in the good old days in the Bible, apparently God's will was much more clearly expressed than it is now. Now we don't know what the heck God wants out of us. But back then, God was like booming it out. And we still not only turned our backs on God and disregarded God's will, that's what I was saying to Adam before, but Moses and Abraham, our two greatest teachers, model for us a confrontation with God where we challenge God and we say, we can't buy this. This cannot possibly be what you really, really, really want. So this brings us into the whole mystery of what is one's will. Look, even when Rabbi Gamliel is talking to us about human will, what is he saying? He's saying you can turn your will around. You don't want what God wants. You want to eat the cheeseburger. God doesn't want you to eat the cheeseburger, right? So you really want to eat the cheeseburger. That's your will. Make your will God's will. Somehow or other, there's a way for you to find some other point within your will, within your heart, within your consciousness, where you can turn it around, align it, and find that really this is my will. My will is actually, despite everything, and who knows, past experiences, I'm not going to do this because I want to do what God wants. So now we're turning the tables and we're saying, God, you really want to destroy bad people? Find it within yourself. There's something within yourself that also doesn't want to destroy bad people, that wants to give people another chance. How about it? Or shame on you. That's the kind of God you want. That's what Abraham says. What? Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat? You consider yourself to be a just, righteous God, and this is what you're going to do? Feh. So it begs the question, where do we find God's will? Right? How do we know? So yes, Sarita.
As we talk about this more, it strikes me that these doublets.
No, if you talk down, nobody hears me.
Okay. It strikes me that these cups do God's will, God will do your will. That it brings in this, it makes us that doing God's will is not some mindless act, and that in fact it should be intentional and thoughtful. And it strikes me that when Abraham challenged God, when Moshe challenged God, what we see then is, this whole notion then of God doing their will, right? And that there's a balance here, and that it just isn't supposed to be mindless. It's really something we're supposed to think about. It takes us out of, to both Josie and Audrey's point, it takes us out of our immediate self and gets us thinking about what we want sort of in relationship to other people and how what other people are doing affect us. And so it seems so simple to beginning, but actually it strikes me that this is all about approaching this whole concept. I mean, to Bill's point, we don't really totally know what God's will is, but we're supposed to be thinking in this way. right? This is a mindset of, and a thinking mindset, not a mindlessness.
Right. I want to just add to that, that it takes time, and that it's based on taking time. I can't walk in not knowing somebody else and assume that I know what they are, who they are, what they want, what's important to them, right? Let's think of Ratzon, the will, God's will, as what really is, what does God really care about the most? What does God really, really want? And the way of finding out what another, whether it's a human being or God or my dog, how to find, what somebody or some other wants, you're not going to find it out in a half a second. You're not even going to find it out by reading a statement on a manifesto of theirs, like the Torah is. It's going to take time till you actually know the way that that being functions and so on. Last week, that was part of what Moses was saying to God. Well, let me know you really, really deeply. Let me really confront you in a strong, direct way. And God says, look, I'm God. So you're not going to get the whole picture. But let me tell you what I really, really, for you, what you need to know about me. And even that, we as a tradition have modified and interpreted to say, you know what you really need to know about God? God is ultimately loving and forgiving. That's what you have to know. So the genocide parts are big problems. And they're problems for us, not only against God, but within God. Why, if God is a loving and forgiving God, does God call for all of these horrific actions and responses? But that's a big difference. That kind of question is different than, oh yeah, that Old Testament God is a God of vengeance. We know that's not a God that we can accept and forget about it. Living with someone, whether the one is with a capital O or not, means that there's more to that person, not all of which, that more than that to that one, that is revealed at any one particular moment. And some of knowing that one to the extent that you can is going to be from the accrued experiences, from the give and take, from the ongoing relationship that you have. And then you can even step up and say, you know what, you just said something, I know that that's not really you. And even though you really meant it, you were as angry as possible and you said something really harsh or really ugly, the other person, maybe it's not worth saying it to their face, or maybe it is, depending on when, but the other person will say, you know what, I know that that's not really that person. That's not really that being, because I know so much other stuff. So aligning the will is an ongoing, lifelong journey. And the hope is that we can, get better at it and better at it and better at it. Audrey, we only have a little tiny bit of time, but Audrey brought up the question, what's that whole business at the end about canceling other people's, thwarting other people's will and so on. So if we want to continue bringing that up next week, that's okay. I want to just bring up a kind of a quick answer, which is a statement that I know Martin Luther King Jr. Of blessed memory used to say, and I think he was quoting other people, the arc of the universe bends towards justice, but it bends slowly and we have to do the bending. So there are plenty of people out there, and back to Adam's point, there are plenty of people out there that actually are going to use their freedom not to do God's will. And they're really going to do miserable stuff. And back to Geraldine's point, they're really going to be destructive. They're really going to bring terrible things into the world. How do you confront that? How do you live with that? How do you keep on hoping beyond, when you read all kinds of terrible headlines, like, there it is again, doesn't matter. We just defeated them, and guess what? They're not giving up. And the answer is, if you can align yourself with God's will, then their will not prevail. Right? To keep that up as a hope. All right, we're going to stop there for today,
Yasher
and
koach.
God
Yasher
willing,
koach.
we'll be able to meet next week. Okay. Take care,
Yasher
everybody.
koach.
Thank you.
Koach.
Stay safe.
Carol, everything's okay?
What?